How to prevent war? How to maintain peace? These questions have been posed by nations and people throughout history, and oftentimes the answer is deterrence. Where does this concept come from? When is it used? And does it work? In East Africa, a traditional people cultivate a warrior caste to deter cattle thieves and safeguard pasture lands. In the former nation of Czechoslovakia, Western allies debate confronting Hitler or bargaining with him in the run-up to World War II. On far-off islands in the South Atlantic, a British territory is invaded for a perceived lack of defense. The nuclear arms race of the Cold War raises the stakes of deterrent policy. And on the Korean Peninsula, the United Nations must constantly weigh its options in preventing North Korean aggression without starting a war. What choices do leaders make when facing an adversary? How great a price are they willing to pay for peace?
Major funding for this program was provided by Robert and Marion Oster and L.E. Phillips Family Foundation. Additional funding was provided by Sarah Scaife Foundation and the Lynd and Harry Bradley Foundation, Incorporated.
My name is Johan Norberg. I'm a writer and analyst here in Sweden, and my job is to observe political, economic, and cultural happenings around the world. I want to explore the choice of deterrence in defending one's interests and dissuading enemy aggression. But what is deterrence?
Deterrence is something that everybody learns at school. And the theory is essentially this. If you hit me, I will hit you back. I may even hit you back harder than you hit me, but I will certainly hit you back, so don't hit me.
And so deterrence works when an adversary has something you can hold at risk, and you can credibly do that such that they make a different choice.
One way of looking at it is that you're trying to avoid a reckoning. War or a fight is a reckoning. It will distill who was strong and who was weak. But you want to prevent that by the stronger power reminding the smaller power that we don't need to go to war to prove this.
Is the concept of deterrence unique to our modern world? Is maintaining a credible threat part of human nature? Here, near the German border, Czechoslovakia built a system of fortifications which might have prevented World War II as we know it. Between 1936 and 1938, as German power grew, Czechoslovakia built over 200 heavy block houses like this one, along with over 10,000 concrete pillboxes. It was to be the wall to stop Hitler's territorial war before it began.
After the Anschluss, which was Germany's takeover of Austria, Hitler didn't sit still for a moment. He started immediately to try to destabilize Czechoslovakia, a country he hated because it had been created by the Versailles Treaty. Czechoslovakia had a very large German minority in what was called the Sudetenland.
The German minority increasingly started radicalizing themselves during the 1930s. That was naturally a threat to the security and ability of Czechoslovakia to defend itself in the 1930s. It was also one of the reasons why the fortification of the border regions began at exactly that time.
This Czech bunker has been renovated and is near to its original condition. Back in the late 1930s, these fortifications were state-of-the-art. They were built to resist conventional artillery shells and protected from chemical attack by redundant air pumps and filters. The men inside were prepared to defend overlapping sections of the Czech-German border with armor-piercing artillery and anti-personnel weapons.
Behind the fortified line was to be a motorized army, highly motorized and well equipped with armored vehicles that should be able to liquidate any eventual breakthroughs through the fortified line. The common defense of the Czechoslovak Republic with its allies presented a significant opportunity for stopping the program of Nazi aggression right from the very beginning. But it was assumed that the Czech defense would hold up until the first signs of assistance from the Allies.
With formidable defenses in place, the Czechoslovak people awaited aid and armaments from their allies, the British and the French. But Britain and France had other plans. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain instead attempted to calm Hitler by diplomatic means.
The thing to remember about appeasement is it came into currency in the 1920s and 30s as a positive term. It was in the landscape of sober and judicious politicians, statesmen, diplomats, not repeating the errors of, say, World War I. And they felt that war was not necessarily innate to the human condition, and that balance of power, deterrence, alliances were archaic or ossified ideas. And if you showed goodwill to an aggressor, that magnanimity would be appreciated. It wouldn't be despised as proof of weakness. The problem with appeasement is that until the human condition changes, it's usually considered by aggressors as a sign of weakness to be exploited rather than reciprocity to be appreciated.
Hitler, by mid-1938, demanded that Czechoslovakia should be shorn of the Sudetenland, which should go to Germany. Britain and France cravenly accepted that.
Americans in particular are extraordinarily critical of that choice. But in the context of a Britain that suffered catastrophic losses in World War I, a whole generation of Britain's young men swept away. That makes me actually a lot more sympathetic to his choice of trying to avoid in any way possible a war in which Britain had not yet been attacked, but its allies had been.
The Czechoslovak people were helpless without the support of their allies. They had little choice but to let the Nazis pass between the very bunkers that were built to keep them out of their homeland.
For the immediate short term, appeasement's very effective. You just kick the can down the road and it gets, unfortunately, more serious each time you do that. Hitler had less material resources in the mid-1930s than the combined democracies on the European continent. But he felt that because they were so willing to appease him, there must be some reason why that was. And so he kind of concluded that the winners of World War I were more traumatized than the losers. And that gave him more encouragement to try something even grander and bolder each year.
Within a year, the Nazis occupied the whole of Czechoslovakia.
The British people celebrated in the streets because it meant that there wasn't going to be a war. At least they didn't think there was going to be a war. And Winston Churchill actually said the exact opposite, said that this was a disaster, it was dishonourable, we were going to get war anyway, and he said it in the most beautiful, eloquent Churchillian phrases, and we actually have them here at the archives now. So this is going to be the 1938 Munich speech that Winston Churchill gave in the House of Commons. And here it is. Some wonderful stuff. Here he says, "I therefore begin by saying what is most unpopular and most unwelcome, what every one of us would like to ignore or forget, but what must nevertheless be stated, namely that we have sustained a total, unmitigated defeat." He also says, "There was never any danger of a fight if all the time one side meant to give away completely." That's one of the great obvious truths of appeasement. And this actually has the final moment where he is summing up, and he says, "This is only the first sip, first foretaste of the bitter cup which will be proffered to you unless by a supreme recovery of moral health and martial vigour we can arise again to stand for freedom as in the olden time. The Munich speech was received in the House of Commons in almost complete silence. It was a serious and substantial speech, but not one that drew the hears and the cheers that Neville Chamberlain had. Indeed, Neville Chamberlain had got a standing ovation where every MP in the House of Commons, except for Winston Churchill and 2 or 3 others, had got up to applaud him.
It's very hard to refute the appeaser until the situation becomes dire, and then it's almost as if we pull out of the closet a George Patton or a Curtis LeMay or a tough-talking guy with a cigar in his mouth. We need something at the last moment, and we say to them, we want you to just restore deterrence, quick. These figures that we need in times of global tensions and who understand the reptilian brain, they're reminders of ourselves that we're capable of certain things that we don't want to be aware that we're capable of. And they reminded us of that, and we think they're odious to do so. You know, this character exists in great westerns, like John Wayne and the Searchers, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance.
I said you, Liberty. You pick it up.
Characters are so uncouth, and yet they really have a superior moral sense because they are the only people willing to risk everything to restore order.
Try it, Liberty. Just try it.
However, once the gunfight is over and everything's okay and set to rights, it's always the heroes that gotta leave. They don't belong in peacetime. They're offensive to us. Once the fighting stops, they're throwback to a different age.
One can't help but wonder what might have happened if nations like Britain and France had presented a more forceful response to the Nazis early in their rise. Would it have prevented the deadliest war in history or just delayed the inevitable? Are the lessons learned from the appeasement of the Munich Agreement applicable to the conflicts of today?
The trouble with the Second World War parallels is that they're never exact, but the messages are the same. The messages that Winston Churchill came out with in the 1930s, which is that you only negotiate from strength, that you do not appease unless it is from a position of strength. I think these are just as true today as ever they were.
Some 300 miles off the southern tip of South America lie the Falkland Islands, home to penguins, sheep, and the peaceful people who tend them. This remote, windswept archipelago became the victim of a brief but deadly war in 1982 between the most unlikely of adversaries, the United Kingdom and Argentina. On the morning of April 2nd, 1982, the Falkland Islanders awoke to find an Argentine invasion force had landed. The Argentines informed the Falklanders they were now part of Argentina. They would speak Spanish, fly the Argentine flag, and drive on the right side of the road. Argentine troops fanned out across the islands to occupy private homesteads and settlements.
There's a misconception that wars break out because strong powers always pick on weak powers, but it's not always true. In the case of the Falkland Wars, there's no logical reasons why Argentina could think that they could invade the Falkland Islands and that Britain would accede to that. So why did they think that? Was it based on relative military power? Not at all. Britain was a nuclear power. Argentina was not. Britain was a member of NATO. Argentina was not. Britain had a carrier force that could bring power all the way to the South Atlantic. So why did they try something so stupid? And the answer is that the British inevitably, invariably, accidentally had lost the sense of deterrence.
Although Argentina had voiced claim to the Falklands for decades, here in Stanley, the only town on the islands, the allegiance of the Falkland Islanders was clearly to Great Britain. An ocean away, the British Parliament seemed not to feel as strongly.
The UK. And at the time, I think the British government were hoping for some deal with Argentina, perhaps transferring sovereignty away from the UK and giving it to, or passing the islands over to Argentina.
Max Hastings is an author and journalist. A war correspondent during the Falkland War, he arrived on the islands alongside the British Royal Marines.
Argentina was ruled by a military junta an admiral, an air marshal, and a general, who found themselves in a hell of a fix in the spring of 1982 because they were desperately unpopular and the country was collapsing, and they were trying to think of something to do to make themselves more popular. And they got the idea, in perfect earnest, that recapturing Los Malvinas, as they call the Falklands, was going to put them back on top of the deck politically.
Towards the end of the 1970s, the Navy were looking to make savings wherever they could. And I think, very regrettably, one of the decisions they made was to withdraw HMS Endurance. HMS Endurance was the Royal Navy's ice patrol ship, and it was here in support of the Royal Marine Detachment based in the Falkland Islands. I am a great believer that withdrawing HMS Endurance gave a strong message to the Argentines that Britain were no longer looking to support the islands in the South Atlantic.
Goose Green is a farm settlement about 60 miles east of Stanley. At the time of the invasion, it was home to dozens of farming families.
There was announcements from the Argentine military to say that we at Goose Green were required to all move up to the recreation hall for this meeting. No sooner had the last person got into the hall, and then there was an armed soldier turned up at every window and on the door, and I thought, aha, some meeting, we're now prisoners. And there we were, all 115 of us. And the first few nights we were sleeping on the bare boards. Nobody knows what's going to happen or what's going to come. The biggest worry of all is the unknown.
The Argentines took it for granted that if they could just establish the fact of their having the islands, that no British government in its senses was going to send a task force 8,000 miles to get these islands back. They didn't understand the British, and above all, they didn't understand Margaret Thatcher.
On April 5th, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher approved the sending of a military task force to retake the Falkland Islands. The looming conflict would be one of the first instances of two militaries facing off with modern warfighting technology, such as fighter jets and guided missiles. On May 1st, the British engaged the Argentines in air-to-air combat. The Argentine pilots were considered extremely capable and presented a threat not only to the British aircraft, but ships as well. Chris Purcell was aboard the British destroyer HMS Sheffield when it was attacked. He comes here, to Portsmouth, near the Royal Navy shipyards, to meet with his shipmates and visit a memorial to the ship he once called home.
I was on the starboard side of the ship. I stood next to the pilot, and he looked out and shouted, "Exocet," and I see this fireball coming towards us, and then the missile came in. Didn't explode, it was like a thud, and within a matter of seconds there was thick, acrid smoke all over the place.
And then the rest of the afternoon was firefighting, throwing ammunition over the side, which was underneath the fire, so it didn't cook off. Just, you know, and I think 5-6 hours went in about 20 minutes. It's gone, you know.
There was lads with ropes, with buckets, and to the sea, and throwing it onto the bulkheads and the deck. But it was that hot, the paint is bubbling on the side of the ship. You just throw it and it's steam.
The attack would kill 20 British seamen before the order was given to abandon ship. The Sheffield burned for nearly a week before it sank.
And we all started to wonder whether the British public would turn sour on the whole war. But the war was quick, and Thatcher and her commanders always understood that it had to be quick, because otherwise the diplomatic pressures from the United Nations, from the Americans to reach a settlement, and the political pressures were going to become intolerable. And that's the first principle about wars, that if you're going to fight a war, make it quick and make sure the enemy is not too good.
Tony Smith is a native Falkland Islander. An expert on the conflict, he offers battlefield tours to visitors.
Looking out in front of us there is San Carlos Waters, where the British forces landed on the 21st of May 1982. This was a brigade of British forces here, 3 commando brigades, so it numbered in the region of 4,500 military personnel.
Gary Clement was a British Royal Marine who took part in the task force sent to retake Stanley.
Anybody who tells you they wasn't frightened is telling lies. I'd done 4 tours in Northern Ireland, and I was also in Cyprus for the troubles in Cyprus. But this was different, you know, this was soldier on soldier and jet aircraft and things like that, you know. It was frightening. I'll be honest, I couldn't stop my knees shaking at one stage, you know, because of the fear of what was coming.
Yeah, right behind us is Mount Harriet, and one of the biggest battles that took place was on this mountain right behind us. This area is like a horseshoe of high ground around Stanley, and after the taking of these mountains, that was basically the end of the Argentinian defence. So, yeah, they surrendered on the next day.
The Falklands were once again under British control. Thousands of Argentine troops were disarmed, marched to the shore and sent back to Argentina. This Argentine helicopter was destroyed by British attack jets and left in the bog. Not all relics of the Argentine invasion are so benign. Thousands of mines were placed across the islands by the Argentine military. From time to time, they still maim sheep and cattle. Mine-clearing operations like these are a constant reminder of the war. Britain had repelled the Argentines. In the years that followed, they invested heavily in the island's defenses and constructed a military airbase, RAF Mount Pleasant, in 1985.
Today we have sufficient military forces based here in the Falkland Islands to provide a credible deterrence. We have some fighter aircraft, we have sufficient troops that can be moved around the islands, we have a naval presence in the islands. We believe it is sufficient to deter any aggressor from thinking about invasion.
Relations between Great Britain and Argentina have improved, but in 1994, as if to draw a line in the sea, Argentina wrote its claim to the Falkland Islands into its constitution. It remains there to this day. The Gatling gun. When John Gatling patented this revolutionary weapon in 1862, the battlefields had seen nothing like it before. The Gatling gun could kill foot soldiers by the hundreds, and many believed that this would finally illustrate the futility of war. Sadly, even this mass-killing machine did little to give men pause. In 1870, British author Wilkie Collins wrote, "I begin to believe in only one civilizing influence. The discovery, one of these days, of a destructive agent so terrible that war shall mean annihilation. And men's fears will force them to keep the peace." Such was the hope of the scientists and military leaders who, in 1945, gathered to witness the final test of a weapon that would surely end all wars. The first atomic bomb was almost unearthly in its indiscriminate destructive power, for which there was no practical defense. Hiroshima and Nagasaki smoldered in ruin. Japan surrendered. The end of World War II had brought forth the new standard in military might, and another war, a Cold War, was about to begin. America continued to develop atomic weapons, but was not alone. 4 years later, the Soviet Union tested their first atomic bomb. beginning an arms race that literally shook the earth. The two superpowers evolved a new strategic doctrine called mutually assured destruction.
Mutually assured destruction implied that neither the United States nor the Soviet Union could risk a first strike because the retaliation would destroy the initial aggressor. And the theory of MAD, of mutually assured destruction, was that therefore there would not be a hot war. The Cold War would have to stay cold.
Defense was the order of the day. And in defense, the United States built 150 missile silos, like this one, throughout western South Dakota. And there were 1,000 in the whole of the Midwest. Until the early 1990s, each contained a fully operational Minuteman missile, equipped with a 1.2 megaton nuclear warhead.
Okay, and you're on your own.
It's important to remember that at the beginning of the Cold War, in the late 1940s, there was only one way to deliver an atomic bomb, and that was by plane. For that period, right into the 1950s, there really wasn't a state of mutually assured destruction. And it was only later that the superpowers acquired the capability to deliver them from intercontinental ballistic missiles launched from land sites, and thirdly, from submarines.
The combination of land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles like these, along with long-range strategic bombers and submarines capable of launching nuclear missiles, create what is known as the nuclear triad. It is a guarantee that a nuclear attack would be met by massive retaliation. The second strike would even the score.
This is important because by having three different ways of hitting the other side, the superpowers became more or less invulnerable to a first strike that would have destroyed all their nuclear weapons.
Hi there. Thank
Hello.
you. Johan
in.
Norberg, thank you.
Eric Leonard, welcome. This is Delta One. This facility was operational for 30 years, from 1963 to 1993. During the Cold War, there were 1,000 Minuteman missiles deployed across the United States, mostly in the Great Plains. For every 10 missiles, there was one control center just like this. This facility is preserved to its last use in 1993, when it was retired after the end of the Cold War and the START Treaty. Think of it as a frontier fort, not of the 1860s and the frontier era, but the 1960s. We're descending 31 feet underground beneath the soil of South Dakota. We'll proceed this way. You're walking past the blast door here. Watch your head and your feet. Welcome to the control center.
Thank you.
This was an office for two. If a launch order was received, the commander and the deputy would come to the red box here. They'd undo their lock, and inside the red box are keys and codes. The deputy here has the enable system. So an enable code would be put here. You have individual switches for each of the 10 silos of Delta flight. Once the president says go, you go. You transmit the order, you launch. That process is not designed to question the order.
What sort of damage would one Minuteman missile do?
It erases a city. It erases a military compound. By 1968, Strategic Air Command had 10% of the Minuteman fleet aimed at the anti-ballistic missile facilities surrounding Moscow.
And all of the Minuteman missiles combined then?
Yes.
What would they do?
Change the nature of life on Earth as we know it. That key turn is sort of the last act of history.
People understood quickly when they pondered the theory of mutually assured destruction that it would not necessarily keep the world safe. It might, in 99 cases out of 100, discourage aggression. But in that one case out of 100, it only takes one leader to be half crazy to miscalculate the probabilities for mutually assured destruction to happen.
Dmitry Petrov is visiting the grave of his recently deceased father. It is entirely possible that Stanislav Petrov, as a mere lieutenant colonel in the Soviet army, once saved the world from a nuclear apocalypse. Here, on a street called 60 Years of USSR, in this innocuous apartment block, Dmitry lived with his father and is keeper of his story.
В 1983 году отец служил в советской армии.
In 1983, my father served in the Soviet Army in the rank of lieutenant colonel. And about once a month, he would be the duty officer at a nuclear attack early warning facility. He was a senior duty officer. He was in charge of trained officer personnel. He was in command.
Tension was high. The United States and NATO were preparing to place over 100 Pershing II nuclear missiles throughout Western Europe. They would be able to strike targets in the Soviet Union in under 10 minutes. The Soviets saw a US government preparing for a first strike, headed by a president, Ronald Reagan, capable of ordering a first strike.
The march of freedom and democracy, which will leave Marxism, Leninism on the ash heap of history as it has left other tyrannies which stifle the freedom and muzzle the self-expression of the people.
Nuclear strategy is kind of like a game of chicken. And the guy in the game of chicken who looks most likely to escalate, the least deterrable, has the best bargaining position. You had to demonstrate in the midst of a nuclear crisis, not at all times, but if there was a potential nuclear crisis, in order to enhance your bargaining position, you had to show sort of a depraved indifference, a willingness to just, step on the accelerator and just keep going straight at the guy coming the other direction, to show you were the crazier of the two.
What happened was, at the control desk, there was a signal about the ballistic missile launch. At first there was one. Then there was information about the launch of a second. The level of confidence is 100%, meaning that the information was 100% credible because the computer confirms it is the launch of a missile. Then there was a signal about the third missile launch, then a fourth and a fifth. My father analyzed the situation. But the launch of 5 missiles and not 100, he started doubting it was an attack because a war doesn't start with 5 missiles. The thing is that he could have reported the signal as true and trusted the computer. Then there would have been a response strike. In response to the launch of 5 missiles, over 100 missiles would have been launched from the Soviet Union. He could have just given a command to strike back, but he didn't do that. Can you imagine what kind of situation that was? Can you imagine what it would have been like when unsuspecting Americans would have seen a launch of our missiles in response to a launch that hadn't actually happened? The reason for the signal about the launch was an ordinary reflection of the sun from the clouds. The satellite's sensors recorded this glint and qualified it as a nuclear missile attack. Actually, I've seen similar effects when I was flying on a plane. Just sunlight reflected from the clouds. It actually looks pretty.
Mutually assured destruction or MAD kept the peace because both sides would lose, they'd be destroyed, so who in their right mind would ever do it? But it also had an unfortunate ramification, and that is once you decide not to use nuclear weapons, then they don't exist anymore, and you go back to the ancient rules of deterrence, and that meant you're going to have proxy wars in Vietnam, in Korea, throughout Asia and Latin America, in the Middle East. So it was ironic that mutually assured destruction kept the peace on the nuclear level between the superpowers, but it turned that competition into other areas.
Many people may believe, naively, that with the end of the Cold War and the disintegration of the Soviet Union in 1991, the danger of World War III receded. But that's not quite right, because nuclear proliferation has created a growing number of powers with nuclear weapons. During the Cold War, non-proliferation was something that the superpowers quietly agreed on. The agreement was, let's not let this club get any bigger. Let's keep it small. The most troubling case is that of North Korea, which is a relatively recent new member of the nuclear club that wasn't supposed to be allowed to join it.
At the Joint Security Area in the Korean Demilitarized Zone, South Korean guards engage in an almost ceremonial standoff against their North Korean counterparts. Only here, in the Korean Demilitarized Zone, or the DMZ, do North and South Korean forces stand face to face, 365 days a year. It was here, in 1953, that North and South Korea signed the armistice, ending the hostilities of the Korean War and establishing the border between the two Koreas. A concrete line clearly divides North from South. This room straddling the border between South Korea and North Korea was built for diplomatic meetings, though for the most part it looks like this, empty, but for two South Korean guards, including one standing guard at the door to the north.
There's been an asymmetrical relationship the last 20 years between North Korea and South Korea, and it runs something like this. That North Korea has been able to violate conditions surrounding the use and respect for the demilitarized zone. That North Korea has killed South Koreans, kidnapped Japanese, sent missiles into the airspace of other nations and then in the region, sent boats in to their sea space, territorial waters. And all of that's been predicated on the idea that they're lunatic and that a oppressive cadre is not acting as representatives of 30 million people who are forced to eat grass and are suffering. So wealthy, sophisticated nations have said, let's just contain North Korea. And unfortunately, if the authorities won't do anything, and there is no authorities in the international world, you have to act unilaterally to restore deterrence, and that has not happened.
This is the North Korean village of Kijongdong. The North Korean government maintains that it's home to families who work the surrounding farmland. They say it's a model village for the South to see, and it looks clean and orderly. Yet close scrutiny reveals that those concrete structures are empty facades. No rooms within, no glass in the windows. The only noticeable activity in this ghost town is the propaganda broadcasts and the 600-pound flag waving high above the rooftops. In the 1980s, the South Koreans erected a flagpole 100 meters tall. Not to be outdone, the North Koreans built one of their own, 160 meters tall, then the tallest flagpole in the world. Such history of one-upmanship has long existed between the two Koreas, and such action has not been limited to the height of their flagpoles.
Many would say that North Korea is a very unpredictable foe. And I would argue they're fairly predictable because they tend to antagonize, provoke, appease, and demand concessions. And they tend to continue to run in this cycle. And when there is a provocation, what should our response be? What's the balance between deterrence and appeasement? But I don't think you can do one or the other in the Koreas. I think you have to do both.
The Bridge of No Return is a controlled crossing between North and South. Nearby is a small placard. It commemorates an event that occurred in 1976, an event remembered as the Axe Murder Incident. George Chobani was enlisted in the U.S. Army and stationed at the Joint Security Area at the time of the incident.
So I'm going to start with this one. A KPA guard in front of his checkpoint with his binoculars in his, what I would call his aggressive stance. And that's pretty much what we looked at on a day-to-day basis. The North Koreans are very stern. They had their best troops in their positions just as we had ours in ours. Every day when you went to work, you had to be prepared for something to happen. And you've probably heard the term, hours of boredom punctuated by moments of terror. That's sort of the way it was there. This picture is day-to-day operations within the Joint Security Forces. It shows 2 American soldiers, one with binoculars, one with a camera. This checkpoint actually looks out over the tree and the bridge of no return.
Each spring, the view from one of the observation posts on the South Korean side was obstructed by the leaves of a large tree. It was decided that a UN work party would be sent to trim the tree.
We nicknamed the people, excuse the term, Lieutenant Badass, and he was bigger than most North Koreans. And anytime he showed up, there was some kind of incident.
Here's the Korean civilians beginning to trim the tree. North Korean KPA, we call them Korean People's Army. A couple of trucks arrived and KPA started to get off.
And all of a sudden, from around one of their checkpoints comes out Lieutenant Badass. So we knew something was going to happen.
You can start to see some discussions here between Captain Boniface and the lieutenant. For whatever reason, the North Koreans raised some objections, one of which was Kim Il-sung, who's the first of the 3 North Korean leaders. He planted the tree and it had some, sacred positioning, and the North Koreans didn't want it to be trimmed.
Lieutenant Badass wore glasses. I watched him because I was on the side of it. I watched him. He took his glasses off. He rolled them up in a handkerchief and he stuck them in his pocket. I mean, he did this methodical. And then that's when he gave the order. The order he gave was to kill them all.
So here's the mass of people engaging in the fight. You can see that it is tools, picks and axes that are being used against the Americans.
I went around and Captain Boniface was down and his head was split open and his glasses, they hit him here and his glasses just broke in half.
There's Captain Boniface on the ground, so again, it was apparent he was down very quickly.
And they were still there chopping Captain Boniface when I got to the checkpoint. That was his last duty, and he got killed on the last duty because he was flying out the next day.
The Americans deliberated for a few days, then determined that a show of force was necessary. Operation Paul Bunyan was named after the giant lumberjack of American folklore, and this time, the North Koreans' favorite tree wouldn't be trimmed. It would be removed altogether.
Operation Paul Bunyan was the most heavily militarized and military-defended tree trimming operation ever in the entire world. We had B-52s, we had fighters, we had tanks, we had artillery, we had all kinds of things going on to make sure that we could safely take down an oak tree in the DMZ, because we didn't know what the North Koreans were going to do.
We, in the joint security area, had this feeling that everything was lined up behind us, ready to go to war. And what was lined up behind us was helicopter gunships. Behind them, B-52s were circling, ready if the word was given to drop bombs. And then once the Midway, an aircraft carrier, moved in from the Sea of Japan, they were flying jet sorties off the Midway in support of that. As far as we were concerned, it might have been the start of the next round of the Korean War. It was a scary time.
The Army engineers cut the tree down, leaving the stump behind as a reminder. North Korean soldiers did arrive, but they only stood and watched.
Does a North Korean provocation automatically elicit a U.S. response? No. But it does elicit considering what a response might be, whether it be kinetic, or whether it be a show of force, or whether it be sanctions.
Over 30 years, North Korea has found a formula of feigned madness and threat to develop nuclear weapons or the possession of nuclear weapons. And when you weld those two factors together, or you combine them, it has a formula to get massive foreign aid and to develop a global voice influence that's not commiserate with its small population and dismal economy. And they're not going to give that up. They're going to increase that method of operation. So they're going to get more nukes, and they're going to talk more as if they were unhinged.
Would the unpredictable, now nuclear-armed North Korean government concede to a show of force and curtail its aggressive behavior, as was the effect of Operation Paul Bunyan? Or would a show of force invite escalating violence?
All attempts to stop the North Koreans from acquiring nuclear technology have failed. The key reason that this is dangerous is not that North Korea is going to attack the United States unprovoked. It's the danger of a rogue regime with the ultimate weapon that can essentially defy its neighbors and become increasingly a source of instability in the region. And the nightmare from my vantage point is a world in which the non-proliferation regime, which began in the late 1960s, completely falls apart. These things are steadily getting cheaper and easier. A world in which every 2-bit dictator has a nuke is a very dangerous world. Even if it's only by accident, the probability of a nuclear war goes up very appreciably. And we should really be thinking of the North Korean problem not just in terms of Kim Jong-un's ability to hit California with a nuke. It's all about his ability to cause non-proliferation, to break down as a regime. If the Far East or the Middle East become completely nuclearized, then the probability that we see an actual nuclear war in our lifetimes gets to be very high.
On April 7th, 2017, a terror attack was carried out in Stockholm, Sweden. A man, acting alone, drove a truck through a crowd of pedestrians, killing 5 and injuring more. The truck smashed into a department store, bringing the attack to an end. Handwritten notes to the victims cover the temporary plywood facade of the store's damaged windows. They are a grim reminder to passers-by that an attack like this could happen anywhere, anytime.
Like other Swedes, I was saddened by the attack, but wasn't particularly surprised by it. Terror attacks like the one that happened here are an unfortunate fact of our times. How can aggressors, like the man responsible for the violence here, be deterred?
Our strategy since 2001 has been to target the leadership. It's a hard strategy to pull off. It's very time-consuming. It's very resource-intensive, but it's probably the only sustainable strategy. The challenge with terrorism is terrorists don't have physical space to hold at risk.
You cannot deter a non-state actor. There isn't a return address, or at least it's hard to find. And by and large, non-state actors are to be found inside states. Are you going to nuke the state that just happened to be the home address of the terrorist? That's extremely difficult. It's a problem that, of course, is even more acute in the realm of cyber warfare, which increasingly is a threat we have to confront, because cyber attacks are extremely hard to trace back.
As technology advances, the violence which might be inflicted by small groups or an individual is terrifying, and so they must be deterred. But how do you know whom to deter, if anyone can be the threat?
One reason why the intellectual establishment and the therapeutic mindset does not like deterrence is they believe that just as technology gets better every year, so does human nature. Laws, civilization, it all vanishes in a second if people are afraid to do something. And when deterrence breaks down, you get into war. What are you willing to do to win? And you've really got to get people and attitudes and philosophies that are antithetical to humanity, to humanism, at least for a brief period. And if you don't do that, you're going to, by your magnanimity, get a lot of unfortunately innocent people killed. And that redefines what morality in war really is about.
We recognize that society, at its most essential, must be defended, and that flagrant aggression met with appeasement has produced disaster. Deterrence is an acceptance of the ugliness that can emerge from the depths of human nature, that some threats can be met only in kind. However, deterrence is always a gamble. Too much and you could escalate tension to the point of war. Even if deterrence were guaranteed to prevent a large-scale war, should it always be the path we choose? Is that a price worth paying for peace?
Major funding for this program was provided by Robert and Marion Oster and L.E. Phillips Family Foundation. Additional funding was provided by Sarah Scaife Foundation and the Lined and Harry Bradley Foundation, Incorporated.
The Price of Peace is available on DVD. For more information or to order a DVD of this program, call 1-800-876-8930 or visit www.freetochoose.net.